Welcome to the Baker Institute. My name is Ken Medlock. I'm the director of the Center for Energy Studies here. Normally, for an event related to water, our fellow in energy technology, Linda Capuano, would be doing the opening remarks. Unfortunately, and she sends her regrets, she was actually called to D.C. As many of you may know, she was nominated to be the head of the Energy Information Administration, and the hearing is actually tomorrow. Today, she's actually meeting with members of Capitol Hill, sort of in the precursor to that hearing. So best of luck to her. What I wanted to do is just sort of launch this event and then get out of the way, and I apologize, I'll have to run out as soon as I step away from the podium. This week is the week that finals begin at Rice, and I have a class of about 100 students, and it's been a steady train in and out my door today so far, so that's what I'm dealing with. But I'll definitely leave you in good hands. So water resiliency, this topic in particular has certainly in the last few months emerged as an incredibly important topic, particularly for city planners, for local residents, many of whom were affected negatively by the events of Harvey, and so forth. And industry in particular is also has been cognizant of these types of issues for a long time. As a matter of fact, here at Rice, we have an entire group in our Civil and Environmental Engineering department that looks at resiliency of infrastructure. So some of the work they do is actually really interesting and definitely relevant to this space. So we're looking at this across Rice, not only from the policy perspective, but also the engineering and design perspective as well. So there's a lot of knowledge, if you will, to be shared and disseminated. On a personal note, I actually grew up in Katy. So I remember as a child, I had friends whose families were into rice farming. Old rice farming families. And Katy grew up as a rice farming community. It's something many people don't realize, but you can still see the big rice dryers, which really don't get used that much anymore, as you're sort of driving west on I-10. The reason I'm telling you this is because it has a lot of relevance to one of the aspects that will be discussed today. I remember when I was in high school riding the combines before Rice Harvest Festival, actually harvesting rice. And the way the entire area was set up, you'd have 1,000 square acres of land devoted to rice farming, and you'd have these 6-foot berms built periodically to square off the land because it didn't always rain a lot out there, right? Some years you'd have dry years, other years you'd have wet years, but you wanted to be able to grow rice, so you always had to have a certain amount of water, roughly 6 inches of water standing for rice to grow the way you wanted it to. Now, typically that wasn't a problem because, as most of you may or may not, I don't know if you know or not, but this is a natural wetlands, this entire area. So, so you figure out exactly. So you figure out ways to manage the ecosystem so that you can perform agricultural activities and such as you see fit. Well, we'd go out and we'd ride the combines, cut the rice. You'd see some years there was a lot more cutting to do than others, but the one thing that, and this is why I'm telling you this, that was always remarkable about that is I remember heavy rains, of course nothing like Harvey, but heavy rains growing up, and there wasn't really any flooding issues. And it had a lot to do with the way the land out there was used. And this is something that most people don't fully appreciate, but when you have land that's designed that way, it's in its sort of natural state, if you will, but it's like a giant sponge. If you go out there today in the places where I actually remember riding the combines, it's paved over and there are communities there. That is the best sort of analogy I typically give when I start thinking about these issues and what it means for Houston and the future of what we need to do to deal with heavy rains, because they're going to continue. That's not going to stop. We're in Houston. Is imagine Houston's a bowl, and you put a giant sponge on the west end of the bowl, and you pour a pitcher of water on the sponge. What's going to happen? A lot of it's going to get soaked up. Some will spill over into the bowl. It's natural, right? Now put saran wrap around the sponge and do the same thing. You're going to fill up the bowl. So thinking about actually how we deal with these issues is relevant. has a lot to do with the way we think about community planning. There really isn't any zoning in Houston, so this issue just sort of happened as a natural result of development. But it doesn't remove us from having the responsibility of thinking about how we deal with these issues going forward, and they're not going to go away. That's the point. So today, I think you're going to hear from an international perspective about how some of these issues are grappled with, from a local perspective, how certain things can be done, particular policy approaches, and more broadly, coordinated approaches among industry, government, academia for thinking about how to deal with these issues. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to hand the podium over to Dick Evans. He's a former chairman of Cullen Frost Bank, and he's a co-chairman with Accelerate H2O, the Accelerate H2O Advisory Committee. And by the way, Accelerate H2O is a co-sponsor of this event. So Dick, I'll hand the podium to you.
Ken, thank you. It's great to be in this wonderful facility and be with you. Please be kind to those students. It's been a long time ago since I was one, but I remember going to my professor and trying to say what answer I put, what it really wasn't correct. Well, here's the real one. Well, welcome everybody. We're glad to have all of you. And on behalf of the Executive Committee and the Advisory Board of Accelerator H2O, it's great to have you. This all started in 2014 with former Governor Perry and now Secretary Perry to address the grand challenge of Texas' water future through innovation and technology. It was in 2015 that it really was formalized because of civic and business and former elected officials and technology and water subject matters experts to form the 501c3 that we have today, known as Connector. And I think it's really important because as Richard and I have gone around the last few years and raised money for Accelerator H2O and told people, we're really a clearinghouse. And when you think of the markets, there are 23 universities, 7,000 utilities, 5,000 corporate campuses, and thousands of farmers and ranchers, all coming together with challenges and some with solutions to try to find the answers. And so we felt that this state needed this opportunity, and I'm proud to be a part of it. And we've made progress. We've generated 2 technology roadmaps. We've held 3 investor H2O forums. We've hosted 7 industry-driven roundtables. One was right here at the Baker Institute with oil and gas industry. And we've produced 15 reports on water economics and workforce development and launched 4 regional innovative water technology demonstration hubs. And today, we're honored to launch the latest and largest demonstration hub right here in the city of Houston. And you're going to hear a lot more about it later and on the agenda. And I want to be very thankful for the leadership provided by Public Works and the engineering departments of the Houston and Houston Water. And we can't say thank you enough to this group that's done so much. And we began today this partnership that will serve Houstonians well into the future for Texas as well as the U.S. Well, this afternoon, you'll hear from global, national, and local experts on lessons learned from the most recent and most historical water emergencies. These speakers were specifically identified to share the wisdom and the insights of what Greater Houston, Texas, and the Gulf Coast can do spirit to become resilient and to apply the best thinking ideas and solutions towards innovation and optimization. I'm pleased that Frost Bank made a significant commitment to Accelerator H2O, and I personally have been very committed. In spending 45 years in the banking business in Texas and the last 20 running Cullen/Frost, I believe that for us to continue this tremendous growth that we have in Texas, the two biggest challenges are education and water. And I encourage everybody to spend some time thinking about that. Certainly we have an organization that we take donations, to put it bluntly. Well, before I introduce our first speaker, let me thank the City of Houston representatives that were here this morning, and I know some of them are here today, and the leadership of the Public Works and Engineering Department and Houston Water. Your efforts have been tireless work, restored one of the largest cities in America, and in the work that came about from Hurricane Harvey, we cannot say thank you enough. You were the first responders to the first responders, and often known as the poop mafia, who stepped up when others could not. And I also want to thank Mayor Turner, who I understand is in China continuing her work for this city, along with council people. And I also want to thank Harris County, along with the Commissioner's Court, in their efforts to start and get this city back on its feet and re-engineering this region. Finally, I want to recognize the private sector, such as Mary Odom and others who have once again come forward to take on the difficult task of raising and using monies and resources wisely. We look forward to the support that Accelerator H2O will do in working with them and others. You who I've been around in the past know that I guess I'd say a nut about the private sector. I don't think you can ever underestimate the private sector to help us solve the more perplexing issues. That's why I would say to you and comment on the work that thousands of entrepreneurs and individuals that are working outside of the formal process, and it's those that Accelerator H2O can bring together as they are in places we never think of, on their cell phones and networks and in neighborhoods, and so we're grateful for them. Well, finally, to introduce our next speaker, and a man who was the Chief Resilient Officer, and on day one, the hurricane hit, and he quickly became the flood czar. I was with him a minute this morning, and Stephen Castillo is done a tremendous job and leading a really big challenge for this city and for this area. And Steve, please come forward. Thank you.
Well, my job got a lot harder as opposed to Harvey, so that's for sure. I'm gonna talk briefly just about what my role really is, and as the introduction said, I'm called the flood czar. I was called the flood czar from day one, and it was interesting when the mayor asked me to become the Chief Resilient Officer. I said, "Well, what is that?" And he says, "Well, go figure it out. You'll find out." But then when he made the official announcement back last May in 2016, he was laughing. He was telling me the day before, he said, I'm going to call you the flood czar. And I said, Mayor, please don't call me the flood czar. He said, it's kind of embarrassing. He says, no. He says, that's a good title for you. And sure enough, after 3 sessions as an at-large council member where nobody knew who I was, spending $3 million running against Mayor Turner for mayor, still nobody knew who I was. The next day, I was out running, and someone said, hey, there goes the flood czar. So it is all about title, trust me. Trust me. So I'm just going to quickly go through some real quick exhibits, because I want to get to a couple of points that I think are important. Okay, you're going to tell me how this operates, Richard?
Just click to the right.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so here are some of just the highlights of Harvey. And I just want to point out that this is constantly changing. The numbers are constantly changing as we get a lot more information from the results of the storm, particularly in particular to this particular number. And this particular number is really pretty alarming in terms of the impact that it had across the entire city. And so I'm going to show you an exhibit a little bit more in the back, but it's really about the frustration of someone in my line of business, stormwater management, has over the years, has been our inability to convince the public as well as the elected officials the need for stormwater reduction investment. And until Harvey, that was never a discussion. And the reason why had to do with the fact that whenever it rained in an isolated area of the city. And because the city's so large, the rest of the city really didn't pay much attention to it. And prior to 2015-16, we didn't get floods year over year. We got them 5 or 6 years apart. And even someone who did flood, after a couple of years, they're back to life, back to normal, and they really just kind of forget. And so Harvey has really changed the dynamics in terms of, as we think about flooding, Harvey has really changed the public's perception of what we're supposed to do as a result of the flood as well. So my role on this particular recovery team is one of what we call mitigation resilience. And so if you think about our recovery, it's really 3 roles: housing, public infrastructure, repair and recovery, and then mitigation. And the problem that we're going to have in terms of mitigation is that is the last thing that is discussed in terms of people who are going to give us the money, because they really are focusing on repair and recovery and not necessarily the investment in long-term mitigation. So if you think about flooding, we're going to be looking at these 3 areas: structural improvements to reduce the threat, acquisition if we can't reduce the threat, or elevation, home elevation. And so I'm going to focus primarily on the impact on the individual homeowner. But this particular exhibit is really kind of interesting, because what it has shown about the effects of Harvey is that it impacted the entire city. In 2015, it was primarily southwest side of town. In 2016, it was primarily up by the airport. 2017, it affected all of the city, all socio-economic aspects of the city. And so now everybody is saying, what are you going to do about it? But I think what's kind of interesting, is there a pointer on this thing?
I think that the pointer is right here on the podium right there.
Oh, okay. So what's kind of interesting is this area right here, which I was just talking to Dr. Bedian about a minute ago, this is Sims Bayou. Why is there very little flooding here? Well, that's because there was a federal project that was recently completed over a 20-year period that showed given an 11-level protection of about a 100-year event. So that is really what we would like to accomplish throughout the entire city. And the question is how do we get there? So that's what's kind of interesting. So if you think about where the money is coming from, now this chart just tells you, the bottom of it just tells you what the city asked for. We're asking the federal government for about $32 billion. And that's just a highlight of the $32 billion. The governor is asking for $61 billion. So the top just tells you what we have gotten to date. So right after Harvey, the federal government allocated $15 billion, half of which is FEMA recovery, half of which is HUD recovery, to go directly to Harvey recipients that were impacted by Harvey. So that's the state of Texas. And then you have Irma, Maria, and the California fires. So the second congressional allocation of $36 billion, half of it was already sent down to FEMA to pay off half of the national flood insurance debt. So that left about $16 to $18 billion of the original 36. And then that number is on competition for all 36 states, 33 of the 50 states that will compete for the balance of the money based on the recovery of 2017. So everybody that was impacted by 2017, whether it was those capital ones I just talked about, Irma, Maria, or the fires, or anywhere else that you had a disaster in any of the 33 states, you're competing for that money. So obviously we're getting less, and we're not getting what we would think we should be getting to be the fourth largest city, and the impacts that we have nationwide on some of the facilities that exist here today. The other problem is that they're currently now discussing the third tranche of money. And we're hearing it could be as much as $44 billion. It could be even more than that. But right now, it's tied up with the budget process. We were hoping that this would get resolved pre-budget process so it didn't get tied up. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. So you can see that the issues are here really are a lot about what type of money we're going to get and when it's going to flow to the city. So this is, again, some of the highlights. The lower part of this is our sister organization, what they're asking for as well. And obviously, their ask was what the governor put in his ask was fractions of what they were actually asking for. So that's sort of the little frustration. So here's my thinking. And here's where my role is on this recovery. So I'm looking at flooding across the entire city and taking it as baselines. So my first baseline is Harvey. So if you go back to the exhibit that showed where flooding occurred, up in Kingwood and on the west side of town, they really flooded as a result of the Harvey event, meaning the event was so large, the impacts of the discharges coming out of the reservoirs, the allegation of the discharges coming out of Conroe, and the inability of Lake Houston to take that water, those are Harvey-related events. So as I'm looking at improvements and looking at structural ways to solve the problem there, I'm using Harvey as my baseline. And that's basically what I'm trying to do. So we're looking at the third reservoir as one impact on the Addicks and Barker reservoirs. We're looking at the possibility of helping to fund the 216 study by the Army Corps of Engineers to reevaluate the operations of the reservoirs, whether or not we need to increase storage capacity, whether or not they need to change the discharge rates. And oh, by the way, we're also looking at downstream effects. Are there improvements that we could be doing on Buffalo Bayou? Probably not to compensate for all of the discharge coming out of the reservoirs, but as an integral part of the total system. And up in Conroe area, now in Conroe, what the people would like us to do is they would like us to convert a surface water supply system and convert it into a stormwater system. And so that's an issue for us because obviously it's our surface water supply. And so the very first thing we need to figure out is, okay, if we lower the reservoirs, what protection it provides? Does it mitigate against Harvey? I don't know that. And so those are questions that we have to answer before we decide to say, yeah, let's lower the lake levels in advance of a flood event and be prepared for a Harvey event. So those are kind of the issues that we talk about. The other, as we relate to the other issue here, which is our critical infrastructure. And this is where Public Works is involved. And they were already working on that pre-Harvey, is whether or not we want to consolidate our wastewater treatment facilities. I think, Yvonne, correct me, 18 of our 39 wastewater treatment plants were inundated, several of them for weeks at a time. So the real question is do we want to rehabilitate and repair in place? Do we want to consolidate our system and abandon those facilities? Or do we want to harden those facilities and use Harvey as the baseline instead of what the current criteria is, several feet above the 500-year flood? So those are some of the discussions that we are having internally. Now, bear in mind, what we're trying to do is get as much money as we can. And the problem is I'm looking out here, and the federal government is not really interested in investing out here. And that's why is that? That's because the federal government, as well as any other type of government entity, they are more reactive than proactive. And mitigation is asking someone to be proactive. And if you think about if they were proactive during Katrina, if they were proactive for Sandy, we'd have an entirely different discussion that we'd be having. So that's one of the problems we're having on the federal side. The next, if you go now, next baseline is the regulatory floodplain. And the real question is whether or not that's the right baseline based on the recent information we've gotten from NOAA and whether or not our 100-year event is going to change. Well, obviously it is going to change, but what is it going to change to? We don't know that yet. But these are some of the things that we need to be working on. But I want to highlight on the one that says map risk post-federal projects, because this is a map of Harris County Flood Control District's 6 ongoing federal projects, 3 of which they manage, and the Corps pays into it, called the 211F projects, and 3 that the Corps manages and flood control pays into. So they've asked for full funding of these projects, both the federal share and the local share. The problem I'm having is this is an exhibit of Project Braze when Project Braze is done. And as what you can see is all of this dark blue here is still the residual floodplain. That will still exist when the federal project's done. What the community believes is they're going to have protection. Well, they're not going to have protection. So my thought process is, should we be looking at beyond the federal project? What can be done to help these areas beyond the federal project? So this area here, this is Keegan's Bayou right here. If I'm able to do some type of improvement here, I can solve all of this flooding right here, because this is an overflow interchange between the two. If I do a structural improvement on Keegan's Bayou, I have to mitigate it so I don't transfer the flooding downstream. So I'm looking at a landfill site that's sitting right here, a 150-acre landfill site that I could move. And then I would have 2,200 acre-feet of storage there to mitigate for the improvements I'm doing upstream. So that's kind of the thought process. And so we've reached out to the consortium. That's a collection of the Houston Endowment, correct me if I'm right, Houston Endowment, Kinder Foundation, and another foundation. Is that correct? Right. And so we've asked them to volunteer their services to look at all of the county's federal projects and see what we can do, because each one of those federal projects is providing less protection than the 100-year event. So we're going to have a residual floodplain. So how do we handle those situations? And then the discussion for me will be, we go back to this discussion right here. Okay, well, if a structural project's not going to work, do we do a buyout? And if we do a buyout, what do we do? Or do we do a home elevation? So those are the thought processes that we're having. So that's sort of the baseline. And then obviously you go to the next baseline, which is my last baseline, which is, okay, urban drainage. And what most people don't know, is when I first took this position a year and a half ago, I went to Public Works and I said, do me a favor, plot out a map, show me all the floodplains in the city, and then plot out dot for every house that's flooded in the city. And when I saw the map, I couldn't believe it, because over half the dots were nowhere near a bayou. That's an indication of bad urban infrastructure. So the next thing we need to be doing is we're going from the high-level Harvey impact to the regulatory floodplain to now the things that Public Works does on an everyday level. And how do we handle and how do we address our urban flooding? And so these are some of the issues that are really ongoing. I mean, prior to Harvey's event, we were already looking at our detention requirements through task force. And I know the mayor's going to be rolling out a recommendation as a result of that particular task force. Prior to Harvey, we were already looking at gray to green infrastructure. In fact, I'm happy to say that we've had some successful discussions with the Houston Endowment to advocate and develop an incentive program to get developers to convert from gray to green. And that's really what we want to do. We want to kind of change that concept. We want to get to the sponge. We won't be able to do it all over the place, but you have to start somewhere. Is that right? So this is a process that we're going through. So that's my thought process and how I'm interfacing with the recovery team. So this is my contact information and my former chief of staff. We are a department of 2, and we have 0 money, okay? But what I tell everybody is, at the city level, I'm messing everybody's mess kit. And so the mayor and I talk every other week, and he says to me, Steve, what are you working on? So I tell him what I'm working on. Oh, okay. So, and that's how we kind of work through this process, because the one thing that I've learned from this effect of Harvey is that recovery is not the total solution, is that the public is demanding a change in thought. And if we don't change the way we've been doing things in the past, we will continue to get what we've always gotten, which is this flooding effect and flood risk. And so the public is demanding, no matter what you do, we want you to change how you do in normal business. So that's where we are today on recovery. I am an integral part of a bigger team, and the frustration we're having right now is the lack of money. So we're hearing that $5 billion is coming to the region. We don't know how it's going to get to the city of Houston. Even if they would tell us today that we had it today, we wouldn't see it until maybe May. And so what we're trying to do, as I was telling someone earlier, what we're trying to do, and as the mayor has asked us to do, is set up the infrastructure so that the day you get the money, the next day you're swinging hammers, so to say. So that's really what the recovery team is doing right now. So I'll answer any questions, but I know there's a lot of speakers here, so I appreciate your time, and thank you for coming today. Thank you.